Hi everyone. My name's Jonathan Soden. I am the owner of the Soden collection, and tonight we are doing our first ever live art talks. Hi everyone. Hi everyone that's joining now. Um, so the reason for doing this was I was contacted by a client last week, and a few texts went backwards and forwards, and it was interesting that he was actually quite bored through lockdown. So it was an idea that just to add something a little bit different. Hi, Teresa. So each week as we go along, we'll introduce another artist. We've got abstract artist Ian Reyes Smith, screen print specialists Anna Harley, Chitra Merchant, Kit Andrews, and also some other special guests. But tonight we've got Sculptor Jacob Chandler. So I'm just going to invite him in to the chat. A few minutes or next moment or so he'll be coming in with us. So, hi Jacob.
Hey, sorry, I'm a bit early.
That's all right. How are you?
Yeah, very good. Thanks yourself.
Good. Yes. Very good. Very good. Just going to turn my little volume. Um, Before we start, hi Mark. Before we start, if anyone wants to ask any questions, then there is a comment box. There's a little sort of speech bubble with a question mark in there. If you want to ask any questions there, and then we can discuss those as we go through. So, Jacob, you're a sculptor.
Yeah.
So, so if I just show you behind me, we've got some of Jacob's sculptures here. There we go. So as we probably talk and go into a few things a little bit more in depth, we'll probably refer to a few different sculptures that we've got here. So, Jacob, should go straight into it. So, how many years have you been a professional sculptor?
It's quite a difficult one to actually gauge. I started sculpting probably about 6 or 7 years ago, but it was very much more of a hobby at that point. Um, I would say in terms of actually professionally sculpting, probably within the last 4 years. It's gone from being a hobby to a career that pays bills. And I think that's really the defining point. So I'd say about 4 years.
Yeah. And what were you doing before that? Have you ever had sort of a full-time job?
Yeah, so well, I briefly started studying architecture because I love sculpture, but I thought I've got to get something that's going to pay bills. But off I went to study architecture, but got really ill, and a very short time into the course had to defer my entry. So I sort of gave myself a year to sort of have a little bit of a sort of try and find exhibition space, do a little bit of sculpting, but alongside that, I also got a part-time job, and I worked in Lush Cosmetics for a few years. So it would be a case of I'd go off to work and come back covered in glitter and lovely smells, and then go down the shed and come back covered in metal dust and grime. So it was quite an interesting contrast.
I think the word contrast is probably a good thing. A
Yeah.
good thing to point there. So, within your sculpture, then, what materials have you worked with so far, and what's your chosen? Maybe yeah, What's your choice for for those materials?
So when I started, I worked a lot in steel. I learned to weld when I was about 13 or 14. My dad taught me, and um, my dad trained as a blacksmith for a few years. So we built a forge out of an old lorry brake drum, and metal at that point became something magical to me. It was something that could be fluid. Was something that you could bend. So it didn't become such a brutal sort of material that you see and think, nothing will ever move that unless like a car crashes into it. It was something that you could heat up and between your hands just bend a thick piece of metal. So I started with steel, and I love it as a material. I think it has a beautiful texture. But then I started to move. Well, I worked with a company called the Metalworks, and they made my first life-size piece with me, and that was a piece in core 10. And I realized that the longevity of the material has to play a part in it. Mild steel requires huge amount of maintenance all the time, so it's not ideal for a sculptural medium. So eventually I started working in bronze because it has almost an infinite longevity. You know, you they're pulling out bits of Grecian bronze castings from, you know, thousands of years ago, and I
Yeah.
think that's really why I love bronze as a material. And I think metal, it's hugely tactile. It's lovely to hold. It's lovely to feel the temperature of, and I think I'm a little bit too obsessed with metal, perhaps.
The core 10 steel sculpture that you made, that
Yeah.
was, if, correct me if I'm wrong, that was poison tension.
Yes.
So what we've got, if we just refer to this one, now this is see if we can switch the camera around actually. So this is a little maquette in bronze of that same sculpture. What size was the sculpture in core 10 steel?
So I think it's 183 centimeters tall. I
Yeah,
think it's 104 kilos of metal, so it's quite a hefty piece.
much
But
bigger than
it's
what's in comparison to my hand.
yeah, and it's interesting to see how the different scales, how the piece works in different scales, because sort of the few millimeters there becomes a few centimeters in a larger piece, and that's, I think it holds quite nicely on both scales. And when I first did it, I wasn't sure whether it would work, but it's nice to see it does.
Yeah, and it's been a very popular piece in the gallery as well,
Yeah,
at such a small scale. And it's nice to see that a piece that was made originally to be so large works just as well in sort of a smaller scale as well.
yeah.
Um, we've um, just had a question in from Teresa. What got you started in this unusual career?
So it wasn't until sort of A levels where I started studying art officially, I guess. But my dad's a creative. He's a graphic designer and a product designer. My mum's a woodworker. My brother works in the film industry. My other brother works for the Solihull Council. So there's a bit of level-headedness in the family as well. But there's creativity in the blood. It's very much, although quite an unusual career path, it wasn't so far off the path for my family to be like, that's crazy, why are you doing that? And then also with the fact that initially I started sculpting as something that I love to do, and I didn't realize that it would become a career. I hoped it would, but it wasn't until sort of a few years into sculpting that I realized that it could be a tangible future.
Yeah, we've just had another question come in from Teresa as well. Would you consider using another material? Have you tried and had any disasters? Good question.
So, um, in terms of modeling the pieces, I started off trying to model in just regular sort of candle wax. And I was taking a piece to a foundry, and it was quite a hot day, and that melted in the car. So that's the biggest disaster that I've had. It was pretty crushing. Um, but beyond that, when I create my models, I work with wood and different resins. So there are a few other materials that I work with, but in terms of final pieces, I think I'd struggle to think of what else I'd use. There's I've had thoughts about milling things out of big blocks of marble and things like that, but I think it's one definitely for quite a way into the future.
Yeah, I think I had an email come in this afternoon from one lady that that couldn't join us on Instagram, but she she commented about your work and how mature your work looks from such a young sculptor, because you're only 26.
Yeah.
Um, but when you look at your sculpture, you don't, well, I don't see, or people that look at your work for the first time don't see necessarily a young sculptor. And I think it's interesting that you say you still got, well, you still got plenty of time to dabble in different materials, haven't you? Because
Yeah.
essentially each material is very, you've you've got to learn the craft in making things in those materials.
Yeah, and even the sort of practicality of what can be done.
Yeah,
It's,
yeah. We've had a question come in. Just trying to see if I can find it. From Mark. How now you've been at it for a few years? Where do you see yourself or your art developing?
it's always a difficult one. I had when I started work sort of a 5-year plan of where I could be, but I surpassed that a few years early, so it's sort of I don't quite know where the future is. But I mean, I my main aim with all my art is to get it in front of people. I want people to see art, whether that's in a gallery, whether it's outside town centre, whether it's in a bus station, whether it's in a train station. If there are people that can see it, that's what I want for my art. Um,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I've lost the question now.
That's okay. Rob Lecky has asked, how are limited editions produced? Which I
So
think is,
I create a model, uh, various different sizes depending on the piece, and then up until now, that model has been taken and it's had a silicon mold made out of it. So it's sort of a flexible, almost. I mean, the only thing that I can think is like a baking tray. That's what it is. In the same way that you can pull a loaf out of a baking tray, it's the same sort of thing, but for the sculptures. I'm moving to something slightly different now, and they're developing different resins that can be 3D printed at such high quality that you can cast directly from the 3D prints, which means that you don't have to have the expense of making the mold. And if you need to change anything sort of after you've finished modeling the piece, you can 3D scan it and alter really fine details on
mm,
computer software. So that's opening up whole different worlds of things that could be done.
yeah.
But it's
And
okay.
that
So once
technology,
the mold is made, oh sorry,
I want to say that technology is very, very new as well, isn't it? Because the casting process is, well, it's an ancient process, isn't it? It's
yeah,
been done for many, many years. So
yeah,
it's nice to see, from my perspective, it's nice to see a young sculptor looking at different ways of producing work and kind of pushing the boundaries of what can be done in sculpture.
and it's still such a young technology that there's so much potential. I visited one of the foundries and they had one of these Oculus headsets. So it's sort of a virtual reality headset. So you put these goggles on and you can see this object in 3D space and you can have little controls and you can move bits of material in it. And then I've been to other conferences where you can have a pen which it's connected to a sculpture in a computer and you can push and you can feel the force of pushing against this material. It's not there. You're just
Wow.
working in 3D space, but it's really cool and could offer some fascinating sort of changes and opportunities to play with different styles.
That's crazy, the fact that you can feel the tension, because that the to almost artificially reproduce a touch is something so new, isn't it?
Yeah,
Wow.
absolutely. And I mean, I don't know how they could do it, but I imagine you could get to a point where you put your arms into a frame that's held and you can feel anything, I guess, really, which is amazing.
Yeah, pretty scary. We had another question in from a customer. She says, "What large scale commissions have you done to date, or have you had to date?"
So there's been a few that are completed. There's the Dancer, which is outside Telford Town Centre. That's a 3 meter tall bronze piece, um, and that was finished in 2019, just the end of 2019. And then there's been the Cold Embrace, which is also in Telford, but in Maxell Gardens, and that's a just under 2 meter tall piece. It was a memorial piece for the 75 years since the end of the war,
Yeah.
and it was an interesting piece because they wanted me to capture the joy of the end of the war, but also in a memorial. So there's sort of a bit of an oxymoron of a celebration and a memorial all at once, but it was a wonderful project because the Telford Council managed to connect me with a local veteran whose boots were used in the piece. There was a scan taken from the bottom of the boots, and they were cast and sunk into the base of the sculpture. So the piece almost had a history before it had started. It was, it had a legacy, and I think that was wonderful. Um, Beyond that, there's another couple of pieces that are being made at the moment. There's sort of I can only say so much about them, but one of them's a 3 meter tall horse and jockey, and the other one I can't say much beyond. It's a sort of meter and a half
Oh,
piece for a service station down in Rugby.
wonderful. That's great.
I'll say
That
hi to Alex. Yeah, I do remember you.
where's Burr? Is it Burr House? Burr's
Yeah, so
House.
Bear House is in Hampstead. So that was one of the earlier exhibitions that I did, and it was, with some really great artists as well. So it's nice
Yeah.
to have them connect again, which is really cool.
Again, for the people that are just joining, there is a an icon down at the bottom of the screen. So if you want to comment or if you want to ask any questions, they're more than welcome to ask away, and we'll try and get through as many as we can. Um, the one question that I wanted to ask was the titles that you title your work. For example, you've got Poise and Tension, Poise and Elegance, Poise and Strength. Um, there's a definite ring to all of these. So,
Yes.
in your own words, what's the reason behind the poise and subject matter?
So with all my works, I try to capture something that is relatively poised, relatively beautiful, and although there's further rationale, it is I want to create something of beauty, and but beyond that, linking in slightly to the rationale is the fact that these people, these animals, are athletes at the peak of their game, sort of, and they are one injury, one twist of an ankle away from ending their career. So although they are physical specimens, they are poisoned. They are one misstep from ending their career. So that poise and becomes poison, tension, poison, elegance. Um, so that sort of plays into why they have that name. I am considering steering away from it because it's starting to get a little confusing, but I I like that sort of almost subconscious thought behind the piece. And when you say the name, it can often be misinterpreted as poison rather than poise and.
Yeah. But I suppose the sculptures that you've done to date are very much modelled on that split second movement in, like you says, that athlete's career that um, that you only usually get to see. Well, you don't usually get to see it very often because it's there for one moment and gone.
Yeah.
Um,
So that again
yeah,
links into sort of the whole theme behind the sort of body of work. It's moments in time. It is that fraction of a second where things can all go right, things can all go wrong, but also there's the most tension, there's the most dynamism, there's the most potential for change.
Yeah, yeah, lovely. There's just for everyone that's watching, we have in our bio a link to Jacob's online catalogue, which you can see some good images of the work. But there's one in particular. If we can I'll just switch the camera around. Was the poise and strength, because in the catalogue there's a really good image of the model in which you use the image to produce this work from a ballet dancer in America. So it would be good just to see that reference image against the sculptures themselves.
He was a lovely guy to work with as well. He had such a passion for basically cross-disciplinary art. So it was great to be able to get him on board with that.
It's very light in the gallery. It looks really bright in the gallery, but on here it looks quite dark. So sorry about that.
Yeah. No, it's always that's the trouble with sculpture and most art. It's always better to go to the gallery and see it, isn't it?
Yeah, or good quality images rather than a live Instagram. One good question: why do you choose the subject matter that you do?
I think you know, everybody dances. Everybody loves to dance, whether it's in a kitchen or on a nightclub floor. It's something primarily human. I know one of my friends has just joined the stream, so she'll be able to vouch that I throw some wild shapes. But beyond that, there are professional dancers in my family as well. So my cousin, she dances in the Czech Republic at the moment for one of their ballets, the Pilsen Ballet. And I think watching her, you know, fairly petite frame, small, unassuming person, but the feats of power and strength and grace in which she can perform these really difficult poses and positions, it compelled me to sort of sculpt them. And I think, you know, historically in art, there's always been a desire to capture movement, whether it's cave painters drawing the hunt for the mammoth, or you know, the vortices using bold line to create energy and dynamism. It's capturing movement has been something people have always tried to do, and I think dance is something everyone can relate to, but also is hugely powerful, and it's sort of become my mantle to try and capture that movement.
And again, forgive me if I'm wrong, but the piece that's here, that was modelled on her.
Yeah,
Was that right?
that's yeah, modeled on Corinne, so that's pretty wild. We don't have a normal family. I think people are probably starting to realise.
It's quite an eclectic mix, then, isn't it? The fact that you've got joiners and blacksmiths and artists and a huge creative family.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, you know, my granddad was a lawyer, so there is sort of a level head and some brains in there as well somewhere.
Yeah. Um, so actually, we had another question come in. Ross said, "What are you working on at the moment?" I think we touched on that very quickly, didn't we?
Yeah, I always touch on it quickly because there's only so much I can discuss. So there's a few different commissions that I'm working on. One is for a 3 meter tall horse. The other is for I think probably about 1.5 meter long sculpture that's going down in Rugby. Um, and then there's quite often I'll be bidding for other pieces, bidding for other like entries into different competitions. So there's a few exciting ones that if you know I get accepted into them, I'll be shouting them from the rooftops. But at the moment, there's only so much that can be divulged, which is a shame.
And are you working on, so that's sort of your commissions, or
Yeah.
the big pieces. Are you working on anything sort of smaller scale, like the tabletop versions that we've got in the gallery?
Yeah. Yeah, I do have a few smaller pieces that I'm working on. One is another dancer, and then I've got another one which is two figures, and it's um, the inspiration is rugby, so very different, but still a lot of
Yeah.
power and a lot of movement. And it's a really interesting change to the dynamism because obviously there's a elegance to the form of a ballet dancer or any dancer, not so much for a big, bulky 17 stone rugby player, but to try and capture that sort of form in a way that has an aesthetic appeal is an interesting challenge.
So the pieces that we've discussed then, like poison strength, which you used more sort of imagery to create.
Yes.
How, and obviously the piece behind me as well. You've obviously got your family member there, but how do you how do you do that with a rugby player? Have you been out? Have you been using photographs again to kind of create the piece? How have you done
So
that?
I used to play a lot of rugby when I was younger, which you wouldn't expect if you saw me in the flesh. I'm, I don't know, 5'7" and slightly built. Um, but yeah, I have quite a lot of experience in rugby, probably more than, well, almost definitely more than dance, actual first-hand involvement. And I have got photos from my brother used to play as well, so I've got photos from that. And then the there's a local rugby club, Telford Hornet, who's let me have their sort of portfolio of photos. Also, Northampton Saints, the fairly, I think their Premiership rugby team, they've let me have their photo library as well. So there's been quite an acceptance of giving me sort of access to imagery. It's been harder, obviously, this year to go out and take first-hand images, but I have some historic ones, and then I've also been given access from other professional photographers, which is great.
Yeah. And does that translate into the horses that you've done as well? Especially with what you said about the horse and jockey and the other horses that you've done. Is that from
Yeah, so
imagery as well?
generally I work from imagery. I think I like to get as much first-hand reference as I can and spend some time looking at animals, looking at dance, watching performance or rugby. But I'm trying to capture those split seconds that are gone in the blink of an eye. So
Mm,
photography is fundamental to trying to actually capture those points, and for me to actually observe them for any length of time,
yeah.
there's no other way than photography, really.
But then it must be quite a talent then to turn that flat image into something that's three dimensional, because you can get the feel from an image, but you've obviously got to be good at what you do to kind of then put that into a three dimensional sculpture.
Yeah, that's where the difficulty comes in.
um, okay, so a few more questions that people have sent in. Sarah, um, how is the construction of a large commission different to that of the bronzes that you can see in the gallery? So yeah,
So,
how is the construction of the large commissions different to the bronzes?
so with regards to the bronzes, they up to date have all been cast. So there's the mold made or the print, and then a ceramic shell on that, and then bronze poured in and cleaned up. With the larger pieces, they tend to be fabricated from flat sheet because casting flat sheets just is not worth anyone's time. They warp, they bend. It's just not practical. So
Hmm.
they I I make my model that gets 3D scanned, and then that's dismantled into all the separate panels, which are then laser cut out either in bronze or in card. The card will be templates are needed and they'll be cut out by hand, but usually just cut straight from the bronze, and then that will all be welded together. I think the big difference, though, I mean, it's all the same material really, but there's a huge amount of internal steel work in the larger pieces. It's sort of like the foundations of a house. There's so much that's not seen, but inside these sculptures, there's so much steel work in order to keep them sturdy and strong and standing up, just in case anyone tries to do anything ridiculous, hang off an arm or anything.
Or climb one of them.
Yeah, exactly. You got to mitigate for it.
We've all tried to do that at some point in our youth.
Yeah. I think there's a photo of me on one of the lions in Trafalgar Square somewhere, which I probably shouldn't admit to.
Yeah, maybe not. Again, we've touched on this, but you say about, well, what are your aspirations and have you a 5-year plan? You said that you've kind of surpassed that, sort of your 5-year plan, but what would you comment on that?
I think I'd really like to get my work into sort of a museum. I think that would really help me. And I think that probably comes from a point of slight insecurity because I am self-taught, because I don't have the sort of degree to back up my qualifications. To have that sort of kudos of being in a museum, that would be lovely. It is for me all about trying to get people to see work. So I'm keeping going with as many of the commissions as I can to try and get work in public spaces. And I think that's probably the main aim. It's, I guess, exploring different technologies and what they offer is potentially something that I'm going to do over the next 5 years. And I think just produce as well, because the pieces take quite a long time. It's not a quick process, the one that I use. So I'd like to expand my portfolio. So I don't know, I've only been going 5 years, sort of thing. To say where I'll be in 5 years seems a million miles away, but I think it's difficult to even fathom where I'll be. I wouldn't have said right now I'd be here. So where I'll be in 5 years, I don't know.
It's interesting though, because sculptors, especially at a young age, concentrate on building a huge body of work. But what you've done is kind of, you've been quite select with the work that you've done to produce it as pieces as we see in the gallery. But where you've been so busy is commissions, and especially commissions that have gone into public places, which almost is a complete reversal of a young sculptor that's starting in in sculpting. I was having a conversation with Halima Kassal this afternoon, and she said when she was first at university, one of the lecturers had said, be prepared as an artist and as a sculptor not to make any money within 10 years. So then you kind of think, well, okay, well, if I'm not going to make any money in 10 years, then you've got to subsidize that with another job to fund life. But what you've been able to do from a very, very early start is have a life that's centered around sculpture, which is unbelievable, and you should be so proud of the fact that you've been able to do that so early on in your career.
Yeah, I keep on pinching myself. It's really pretty crazy. I think when I was commissioned for the Dancer, the 3-meter tall piece in Telford, I think I maybe had 6 or 7 pieces in my portfolio. So for someone to take a punt on I think I was probably 22, 23 at the time, for someone to take a punt on someone that young with just a few pieces is remarkable. And it's definitely helped me get more work, because I think getting that first one is probably the hardest, because you need to prove to someone that you can do it. So that's really been a launching point for me in the last few years as well. So the trajectory is mental.
Yeah, I suppose, like we've discussed, the difference in making a tabletop piece, as what we call it in the gallery, to a monumental size is so different and so complex. I mean, for example, like if we just take which one have we? If I switch the camera around again. So for poise and strength,
Yeah.
from start to finish, how long did that take you to do? Month-wise?
I would say probably, in terms of my hands-on time, probably 4 months, maybe 5.
Yeah. But then also you've got to factor in then that it goes then to the foundry, and then how many people would you say work on something like this within the one foundry?
I think I work with fairly small foundries, so for me it's 2 or 3, but it's not a case of how many people. For me, it's not a case of how many people work on it. It's how many people can work on it, because it's quite unusual work, because it is so angular, so geometric, because there are these big, wide, flat planes. Any imperfections will be seen. So you need people that are really good at their job in order to create them to the level that they're finished.
Yeah. So I just showcasing a few, because I don't want my big face on the TV, especially when you've got some nice sculptures behind you. There was a question. Oh, here we go. When viewed from different angles, your sculptures often present surprising and unpredictable details. Why do you go to so much length?
I think, sculpture for me is fundamentally three-dimensional. It has to have a good angle from every angle. And I love the fact that the piece will change as you walk around it. And to offer that level of difference from all angles really means that, you can continue to look at the piece for protracted periods of time and see new things in the piece, and see different things, and you can see teeny little gaps that you may not have noticed on first inspection, and see little bits of light shining through in different weather conditions. So I think that is why I think it's important to add that level of complexity to the piece. And I have no issue with classical sculpture, but you sort of can look at the front of it and know approximately what it's going to look like at the back. And I'm not saying that all of my pieces are completely different. Some of them you can probably predict, but I think it's important to leave people guessing to some extent, to encourage them to go around to the other side. And I love when you have the pieces in the gallery with a mirror behind it, so you can get that full 360 view of it. I love that.
Yeah, I think the one piece that, as you were talking, is going back to poise and tension, because if I switch this around, that's quite a large, I don't know what you call it.
Flat planes, let's say.
Yeah, exactly. And it's quite a demanding sculpture from that angle. But then when you switch it around to, if I get the white background behind it,
it almost disappears.
It almost disappears. And then that line that starts from his shoulder, here, filters all the way down. Sorry, it's going in and out of focus because it's so thin. All the way down here, and then follows that line down. And I think that, especially in the larger, almost 2 meter sculpture size, it is it looks just incredible at that scale.
Yeah.
There was also, I think it was this piece. Again, the frontal aspect of it is quite a demanding piece, but then as you filter round, it again almost disappears, apart from creating some nice shadows. Lovely. Right. So, excuse me. How do you see your process developing? I think that's quite a good question.
Yeah. I guess what it comes down to some extent is the way technology develops. I've spoken earlier about 3D printing the sculptures. I also know of other large scale, like industrial foundries that print the sand castings as well. So rather than having to print something that's sacrificial, you just print the cavity for the bronze to be poured into. So that is a phenomenal new development in 3D technology. So that could be an advancement and could offer, you could have hugely complicated internals to a piece without sort of, well, it would make it a possibility.
Yeah.
So I think that's probably the main way I can see it developing. I'm not really sure in terms of style because I'm at such an early stage, as I've said too many times. But even in terms of subject matter, I've maybe done 8 dancers, and it's not really an exploration of the topic yet. So I think there's a fair amount of time that I will explore this. I think one thing that I'm interested in and is sort of something that I'm thinking about is reducing the number of lines. I started with Poise and Tension, and it's a relatively simple piece in terms of the number of facets, and I've increased the number since then. I'd be interested to sort of strip things back and see almost at what level the facets become are still recognizable as a figure, sort of, back to the cubists and Mondrian in his trees and going down to just the distill movement. I think that is something that I'm interested in, but again, it's way off at the moment.
Yeah. That's a good goal to have, I think, because it's Picasso and Matisse that were drawing in such a way that how many lines can you get away? Well, can you reduce things by to still give off that the intention of what it actually looks like? And I think to push yourself so much to kind of, I don't know whether you could do one facet. That might be a challenge. That's such a good project to start thinking about.
There's a quote. I think I come from more as much of a design background as I do from an art background, and there's a quote, and I can't remember who it's by, and it's bugging me. But it's a great designer knows that the design is complete, not when there's nothing left to add, but when there's nothing left to take away. So I think that's quite a nice thought for going forward with my work.
Yeah, but that almost answers the question of when do you feel as if something's finished?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, really nicely. I think for me it is just a feeling of that is right. There's a huge number of hours spent sanding, looking at the piece, and I'll ask for opinions and I'll sort of take and leave them as I see fit. But the piece almost resonates when it's done. It's just right, and it's difficult to quantify quite how I know when it's done, but it's more a feeling than a tangible sort of number of hours or degrees of accuracy. It's just when it feels like it's right.
Yeah. You mentioned a few artists there. Do you have any artists that you would probably say are inspirational to you? Possibly not to your work, but to you as an individual, as a sculptor.
In terms of um, me seeing sculpture as a tangible thing, I can almost point exactly when that happened. That was Lost in Space Gallery at the Hayward of Anthony Gormley, and it was far more interactive than any exhibition that I've been to. You sort of entered the gallery and almost immediately went into a cube of smoke, dry ice, not smoke, people will be dying. This cube of steam, and you couldn't see people until they appeared, within 6 inches of your face. And sculpture became something that you could be a part of. It wasn't just a stuffy old painting on a wall to be looked at. It was something you could be part of. And the exhibition culminated by going up to the rooftop of the gallery, and you'd view across the whole of London, and you'd see figures dotted around the skyline, and then you'd realize that you're one of those figures dotted on the skyline. So to me, Gormley has to be one of my big influences, because that is the moment that I realized that sculpting was something that was hugely powerful. And I had a very different but similar in terms of emotional experience at Giacometti's exhibition at the Tate a few years ago, and I can't put into words what it was, but I felt moved, and I think it was probably the fact that you had this guy's entire life laid out in front of you, his whole development, and to see someone's life work in such a tangible way, it was really incredible. And it was I found it amazing to think that I might be doing that, not necessarily to the same extent as Giacometti, that's not what I'm saying, but I'm leaving tangible traces of me in history, and I find that really, an honor to be able to do. I think, I love Henry Moore's work as well. I love figurative sculptures, Lynn Chadwick. I could go on for a while, so maybe next question.
I suppose, would you ever consider doing installation work, and how would that work with sort of the way you do sculpture at the moment?
I think it's something that I would consider. It's not something that I have really considered. I think to give someone a whole experience, mind, body, and soul sort of thing, it would be really incredibly powerful to do that. It's not something that I've considered enough to be able to say, oh, this is what I'd do for it, though.
Yeah, I think when you're an artist and sculptor, ceramicist, you deal with the gallery, and you have a good relationship with a gallery, but you don't always hear back the comments that people are saying on a full-time basis, whereas I do. And you don't, as a gallery, you don't always feed that back to the artists. But like when you said, when you went into the Gormley exhibition, how that made you feel, was quite emotive, and it was very powerful to you.
Yeah.
But people also see your sculptures as doing that to them. It's just that you don't necessarily hear it all the time. Gormley probably doesn't hear it all the time.
Yeah.
Well, he probably does.
Yeah.
But it's just interesting, again, from the small body of work that you've put together, you are getting that kind of reaction already. And what, 5 years again?
Yeah. The pressure's on now, though, Jonathan. Go.
Next 5 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's going to be an exciting 5 years for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Right. Well, I think we'll wrap up there. There's, as I said before earlier in the talk, we've got in the bio, in the Soden collection bio, we've got a link to Jacob's sculptures. A link to a catalogue with his sculptures on. So if you want to click that, download it, look through it, got any questions, then let me know. We are doing the live art talks on a weekly basis. So Jacob has been our first. So thank you.
That's all right.
But next week we've got Ian Reyes-Smith. We've also got Rob Leckie, Chitra Merchant, Anna Harley, Kit Andrews, and I'm working on a special guest as well, which might feature in a few weeks. So hopefully we'll see everyone next Thursday when we interview Ian Reyes-Smith. So thank you so much, Jacob.
Thank you.
And yeah, we'll sign off now.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.